All right, I want to take a minute and walk through a slightly more advanced demo. We're going to use what's called a what if parameter to do some scenario testing. And if you look at your modeling tab, you'll see this new parameter button that launches a dialog box that looks like this. Now, essentially, these parameters are preset DAX measures that produce values within a given range based on user inputs: the data type, the minimum, the maximum, the increment, and the default value. And these can be really good tools to use for things like forecasting or scenario testing. So the example you see here and the example that we're going to practice is creating something like a price adjustment percentage captured within a parameter so that we can compare total revenue based on actual information and actual prices against an adjusted revenue based on the parameter adjusted price. And I'm going to show you exactly how that works. Now, one interesting thing to note is that when you create a parameter using the dialog box, Power BI actually generates and creates a new table for you with DAX calculations already in place for the parameter and the parameter value. So those generate series and selected value functions that you see at the bottom of the screen, those are automatically created behind the scenes, although we could build them from scratch if we chose to do so. So let's head back to our report and try creating a scenario test of our own using these parameters. All right, we're going to head to the product detail tab, and you're going to want to follow along closely with this because there will be a number of steps, and we're going to have to get back into our DAX world and write a few new measures to make this all work. So first things first, on the modeling tab, here's my new parameter option. Let's go ahead and launch the dialog box. Now the settings that I'm going to use, I'm going to give it a name, something like price adjustment with a percentage. And that's just part of the title. It's just text because the values that we're going to use, as you'll see, will eventually translate into percentages. The data type is a decimal number, and let's set the minimum to -1, maximum to 1, the increment at 0.1, and the default to 0. And we can keep this add slicer to page activated. So to recap, we've essentially created a scale of values defaulting to 0 with a minimum of -1, maximum of 1 in 0.1 or 10% increments. So let's go ahead and press OK to create that parameter. And so a few things have happened here. It's dropped this slicer onto my page, and I'm going to resize my trending profit to create some room here. So I've got this slicer, and as I drag it, you'll see that it contains the values, the minimum of -1, the default center point of 0, and the maximum of 1. And not only that, but at the bottom of my field list, it's created a new table with 2 new fields. One is the price adjustment percentage, which is calculated as a generate series function. You can see that the 3 arguments that the function takes are the minimum, the maximum, and the increment. And the second field, an actual measure, essentially uses the selected value function to capture or harvest whatever value is currently represented by this slicer. And that means that as we move this slicer left and right, we are producing a value using a measure that we can now reference in other measure formulas. Because if we don't do that, then this is kind of just sitting here as an island and it's not really impacting anything around it. So the first new measure that we need to create is an adjusted price. And if we go into our product lookup table, you'll recall that we've already created a measure for average retail price. What I'm going to do now is create a new measure in this product table. I'm going to name this measure adjusted price, and I'll define adjusted price as the average retail price times 1 plus whatever the currently selected value in my parameter slicer is. So I can search for price adjustment, and you see how it gives me that measure that was automatically created? That price adjustment percent value measure Remember, that's capturing the current value of that slicer. So by multiplying my average retail price by 1 plus that slicer value, I'm essentially defining an adjusted price that modifies my average retail price in steps of 10%. From 0, which is essentially dropping the retail price to nothing, or up to 200%, which is essentially doubling the actual retail price. So that's step 1. I'm going to press enter to create that measure. And now just to see if this is working, let's add a multi-row card and click off of our slicer, add a multi-row card. And the two fields that I want to pull in are my average retail price and my adjusted price. So right now, because my price adjustment in the slicer is set to 0, these two fields should reflect the same thing. And I'm noticing we need to format here. So I'm going to select adjusted price. And why don't we format this as currency? There we go. So now if we move this slicer, you see the adjusted price changing all the way up to a maximum, which should be double the original or actual average retail price, which it is. Other side of the spectrum, we can drop all the way to the point where the adjusted price is 0. So this is working exactly as we'd expect. Let's set it to 0. Let's kind of resize, create a little bit of room here. There we go. And I'm going to drag my multi-row card right underneath the slider there. So that's step 1 and 2. The next step is to actually take that adjusted price and feed that into some of our other calculations in our sales table, like our revenue measure and our profit measure. Because at the end of the day, those are the actual values that I'm scenario testing here. We're really trying to see what impact this type of pricing adjustment will have to actual bottom line revenue and profit. So let's go to our sales table and let's drill into our total revenue measure and remind ourselves how this original revenue measure was calculated. Used a SumX to multiply the order quantity by the product price in the related product lookup table. So rather than reinvent the wheel and create a new adjusted revenue measure from scratch, let's copy this entire measure, press enter, create a new measure within the sales table. I'm going to press Ctrl V and paste that. And now instead of total revenue, this version of it is going to be named adjusted revenue. Okay, and I'm still multiplying order quantity from the sales table. The only difference now is that instead of multiplying quantity by actual product price, I'm going to multiply order quantity by that measure that we just created for adjusted price. So we've removed the related function. We're not pointing to a related price field in the product table. We're multiplying order quantities by this new adjusted price measure instead. So when you press enter, the measure is created. There it is, adjusted revenue. And now the final step from a DAX standpoint is to create one more. And if you recall, we had defined profit as revenue minus cost. Therefore, adjusted profit is simply going to equal our adjusted revenue minus the total cost. So same exact formula, except instead of plugging in total revenue, we're plugging in adjusted revenue. And we'll lock that one in as well. And now we've got adjusted profit and adjusted revenue. So let's take this thing to the finish line and visualize what this looks like. To do that, I'm going to copy this line chart that we've created, paste a second instance, which we can pull in right here. Just going to kind of rearrange things a bit. There we go. And now I don't need my analytics tools here. I can get rid of my trend line. I can get rid of my forecast. I'm going to go back to fields. And instead of simply showing total profit, I'm going to show total profit right alongside adjusted profit. Okay, so now both are being visualized here. And at the moment, both values are exactly equal because my price adjustment is set to 0. Now, if I bump up that adjustment to 0.2 or 20%, look what happens. Now we see that adjusted profit is $549. Total profit or actual profit is $345.74. So what that tells us is that with a 20% lift in the product price for the AWC logo cap, we could potentially increase weekly profit by about $200. And then if we adjust in the other direction, and if we reduce product prices, you'll see that these kind of reverse order, right? All the way down to a 50% reduction in price means that you're actually losing money on that hat. So you can see where the break-even points are. You can see how these different scenarios play out. And remember, this is still at the product level. So everything we're looking at here is related to this logo cap. Remember, we can go back. We can drill into a different product, like the water bottle. And we can see a completely different trend and test completely new scenarios with each product individually. So let's go ahead and just kind of tweak formatting, get things to a good point here. We'll default to a price adjustment parameter value of 0. Stretch this out a little bit. So there you go. Good example of how to use these parameter tools to create different types of interactive scenarios inside of your Power BI reports.